Well, some more bad economic news coming out of the Trump administration. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, as you know, America has been involved in a relatively long-term, if gradual, growth cycle. However, reading in the Tucson newspaper at Tucson.com, an AP economics writer named Christopher Rugaber, if I pronounced that correctly, points out that the gap between the rich and the poor has grown during this economic expansion. He goes into a lot of details, and you know how well details play when people are having a conversation. But in essence, he's saying that the economic growth has disproportionately benefited people at the upper end of the scale, and their wealth has grown tremendously while people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale have not benefited as much. And that would include, for example, African Americans, whose wealth is still at like a tenth of what non-white Americans are. Bill, clearly this is crafted at a time when Democrats are trying to find some kind of toehold to oppose a relatively successful incumbent president. Do you think that resurrecting the Obama inequality or the gap, the wealth gap, holds any promise for any Democratic candidate?
It's all they got.
And
it's all they got. This is the part. This modern incarnation of what we see as Democratic Party politics is nothing, and progressivism specifically, is nothing but the idea of ginning up envy from people to get them to vote you into more power over your lives so that they can give you stuff that other people have. That's basically the deal. You vote for us and we'll take stuff from that guy and give it to you. That's progressivism. That's how it works. Now, I don't suppose that it's going to do much good for the people who hear things like this and just get that exact kind of emotional reaction that kind of headline and that kind of story is designed to generate. But for those people who have any interest in the truth or how things actually work in the world, here's a little moment for you. Just take a regular party balloon and blow it up with, let's say, one or two breathfuls. You've got a rubber balloon about this big. Then you take a Sharpie. I don't work for Sharpie. You could use a magic marker of any kind, but you put a dot here and put a dot next to it. Okay, you just got 2 dots on this balloon. There you go. Now keep blowing up the balloon, and what happens to the dots?
They would get further apart, I would imagine.
Correct. That's exactly what would happen. Even though there's more air going into the balloon, in other words, even though the economy is increasing, because of the nature of an increase, that if the richest person in the world has $100 and the poorest person in the world has $1, that's a difference of 100 times. But if the richest person in the world if the economy grows to the point where the poorest people in the world now have hundreds of thousands of dollars, just for the sake of the argument, not saying they have hundreds of thousands of dollars, but my point is, as the economy continues to grow and grow and grow, the gap increases because that's how geometry works.
Well, and that makes sense, but the guy's not making the case that it's about proportionality. He's not making the case that just because one group of people has a lot more and starts with a lot more and the other group starts with less. He's literally saying fewer middle-class Americans own their own homes, fewer are invested in the stock market, home prices have spiked in wealthier areas. Ironically, he does mention that these are wealthier coastal cities, and he brings San Francisco into the argument as an example of one of those places. He doesn't specifically mention that these areas tend to be dominated by Democrats. But in any case, what he's saying is it's not just that the dots on the balloon are getting further apart. It's that literally those people who were at the middle or lower end of the scale are doing worse than they were before.
That's funny because it doesn't sound like that's what he's saying at all. Did he mention in the article that unemployment among Black Americans was at record lows?
Well, he failed to mention that.
Why is that, I wonder?
He is saying
No, hold on a second. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I don't want to speculate on why an economist would say something, because economists' whole business is speculation, and me speculating on speculating is a little too meta for me.
Well, I'd be happy to go into the meta world for you, and I'd be willing to speculate on the fact that the single most important statistic regarding underclass in America in terms of economic income is that Americans on the lowest level of the economic rung are employed in numbers that they have not been employed in for 50 years, if ever.
So why would the middle class home ownership rate fall from 60% in 2016 to roughly, to 60% in 2016 from roughly 70% in 2004?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, in 2004, we are prior to the 2008 or 2009 meltdown. In 2004, banks were giving out loans like they were giving out toasters in the old days when you open a checking account. You want a loan for a house? Absolutely. If you really want to get into the weeds with this, I'm happy to do it. But first of all, let me just say it's interesting to me that when this guy comes time for specifics about how people are getting hurt in this country, how they're really suffering, it seems interesting to me that the example that he's choosing are the people who live in, the upscale parts of San Francisco and maybe in the Washington, D.C. suburbs and Georgetown and all the rest. I find that an interesting subconscious example that he would use about the hardship of Americans when there's record low unemployment for minorities, but people who living in places like, let's say Carmel or Palos Verdes or someplace like that, suddenly finding their property a little on the shaky side. But let's talk about why it's lower than it is in 2004. In 2004, we were in a period where banks were giving loans to just about anybody because, and this is very, 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 very important that people understand this, because of legislation that was passed that essentially said that we want to see more people owning houses, and therefore we will, speaking as the government, we will essentially guarantee the loan. Now, when you do something like that... This was
the George W. Bush initiative.
It was before George W. Bush. It was way before George W. Bush. It was part of the Community Redevelopment Act. But certainly the Bush administration was on that timeline. No question about that. None. No question about that. You're absolutely right about that. But he didn't start it. But in any event, what basically happens is people said everybody should have a right to own a home. And this is a political movement made by Democrats. Everyone should have a right to own a home. Okay? Wrong. Everyone should have an opportunity to own a home, but the right to own a home is an entirely different story. So basically what happens, Scott? So you've got these banks, and prior to this kind of government intrusion in the marketplace, you've got a bank, and the bank basically says, look, we make money by lending money and taking more money back than we lent out. That's called interest. That's our business model. That's how we succeed. For us to be successful in this, we have to be sure that the majority of our loans, not all of them, because you can never completely get it right, but we have to be sure that most of the money that we lend out actually gets paid back in full. We can afford to take a few losses, but most of the money we lend out has to be paid back in full for us to stay in business. Now, when that's the case, banks spend a very, very critical eye and a very, very well-developed set of rules and formulas and so on to determine whether or not the person who is asking for a set amount of money is likely to pay that loan back, yes or no. And prior to the government getting involved in this situation, a bank lived or died by whether or not this was not a loan, but whether or not it was a good loan. That is the absolutely essential part of that deal. Now, what happens when the government basically comes along and says, look, if people default, we're basically going to cover your costs. Now the banks don't make money by picking good loans. Now the banks make money by the number of loans they make. Doesn't matter if it's a good loan or not. You can't lose. If you got a guy who pays back, great. If you don't, the government pays you back. Fantastic. Now the incentive is not to make as many good loans as we can, but as many loans as we can, period. And when that kind of thing happens, you're looking at the kind of meltdown that we saw in 2008.
So it sounds like you're making the argument that the reason why home ownership is down now is because it's actually closer to where it should be.
Precisely.
That there are,
it's not artificially
in the past, there
high.
were people in home ownership arrangements. Of course, they didn't actually own their homes. They were borrowing it from the bank. But there were people in those arrangements who really had no business being homeowners. They should have been renters.
Well, let me clarify some of those points. But yes, it's interesting to me that he would use 2004 as a baseline. If he were to use 1950 as a baseline, when economics was still economics and made some kind of sense, I'd be very interested to see what those numbers were. But it's interesting that this guy used 2004, and in the same way that it's interesting that he didn't mention record low unemployment for these people that are presumably being crushed under the iron heel of Cheeto Hitler. What I'm saying is that banks were taking risks with people that banks would not have otherwise taken risks with if the normal balance of risk and reward had been in place. Having it been artificially tipped towards the reward side, the banks started not only, look, and I'm not making the banks completely innocent in this by any means. They went out aggressively trying to get loans from people to buy houses. And they were writing loans to people who they certainly knew were unlikely. Not a single bank loan that was ever made, I don't think, was ever a situation where this person cannot possibly pay this back. But in any event, they knew that most of these were pretty shaky. And so this is why the home ownership level was artificially high, because you could get a loan on a house. You could buy a house with no money down and essentially no genuine visible means of being able to continue those payments. All you had to do was sign on the line.
So
and once you signed on the line, the bank was going to get paid.
He's also pointing out that the proportion of middle-income households that own shares of stock has actually declined as well. And the explanation that he draws from information from the Fed, from the Federal Reserve, is that the decline in stock market participation among the middle-income people is a result of more workers taking contract work and other kinds of jobs that offer no retirement savings plans. And so, in a sense, that seems to also cast aspersions at the idea that we're having this great economy with all these jobs, because a lot of people may be working in those kinds of jobs that don't have proper health insurance, that don't have retirement plans.
I think that analysis is 100% correct. And the reason I think it's 100% correct is that more people are taking work as independent contractors or fewer actual employees getting the whole benefits package. The reasons that's happening is because the progressives have made it virtually impossible, at least in a state like California, to have an employee. They've made it virtually impossible. They've made the regulations, the restrictions, the pay, all of it. They've made it virtually impossible. And it's strangely enough, I had an experience just 2 nights ago. I was out with my lovely wife to dinner at one of our favorite Mexican restaurants. There's a waiter there I got to know pretty well over the years. And he was telling me that, and he was plenty upset about this. He was saying that California law now dictated that he could not work longer than a 4-hour shift without having to take a half an hour off. It was required by law. And he said this sentence came out of his mouth 5 times. He said this exact sentence 5 times. The people that made those laws never, ever had to be waiters. Yes. So now California has said, since the sweatshop conditions, that have to be prevented by people of virtue like Kamala Harris and so on, basically what they're saying to this waiter, this hard-working man, is that at peak hours on a Saturday night, when the place is packed and there's a line out the door and their waiting line is probably 45 minutes to get in there, when you're in the swing of things and you are making the money that you need to make for the entire week, you have to stop every 4 hours. You have to ditch the tables that are still open. You have to walk away. You have to go sit in the back room for half an hour, and then you have to come back out again and pick up either somebody else's tables or whatever the case may be. He said it's killing us. Killing us. He's right. It is killing them. And this is why situations like the employment or the shift that this guy was talking about in this article are happening. Yes, there are more contract employees now because the laws that make it, just the simple laws that allow you to fire a bad employee, just that alone, have become so ridiculous that there's no way that any person who's trying to run a business is ever gonna go for this. They have made it impossible for there to be employees, and then they complain about the fact that nobody's an employee anymore and everybody's an independent contractor. You can only imagine my shock.
So not only is there income inequality, according to this story, between the wealthy and the poor, but there's also a racial disparity in this. The average or typical white household has $171,000 in wealth. That's roughly 10 times what the average African-American household has. And before, it used to be just 7 times. According to this article, African-American home ownership fell to a record low in the first 3 months of this year. Bill, what could be happening in the economy that has such a disproportionate impact on African-Americans? What's the racial component in this?
That's simple. I mean, it's simple. It's so simple nobody ever talks about it, but the answer is simple. When a black student goes to high school and does well and succeeds and begins to make progress and get good grades, all of the other people around him in his cohort say he's acting white, and they make sure that doesn't happen, and they use peer pressure to beat him down. What do you expect would happen if that is the social proof that the culture is demanding of you? If the social proof of anybody, any teenager, any adolescent, it doesn't matter what color you are, if everybody's telling you that what you're doing makes you a traitor to your race because you're succeeding at something, what results would you expect?
It seems that there is the suggestion here is that there's some sort of institutional bias in the whole lending system.
It's not. It is not institutional. Absolutely is not institutional. It's cultural. It's absolutely cultural. And when you and this is your entire situation. I mean, what do you expect to get when success in school, in terms of hard work and good grades, makes you a traitor to your race? When you're called white for being successful in school? What results would you expect from that?
So let me just finish up with this, Bill. The economists are arguing that what's needed is simply higher incomes so that more Americans can save and build wealth. And that starts with a higher minimum wage and things like cheaper access to college education so more people can go to college, more family-friendly policies that make it easier for parents to work. Bill, we just need more money. Why not?
Because the $25,000 billion that we've got laid out for this over the last 50 years or so, it's just not enough. That's the problem. It's just not enough money. Look, you can actually come up with solutions to this stuff, and it's not very hard. It requires a little bit of courage, a little bit of honesty, a little bit of fundamental human decency, but it's not really all that hard. When you say things like free education for college, there is nothing, no commodity is free. A kind thought is free, but giving somebody something like giving them a lunch plate full of, mystery meat and green beans, that's not free. And giving them a heart operation is not free either. It's paid for by somebody. So when I talk about the fact that there are solutions, we have to be very careful about understanding what these solutions are. Saying that there's free college is just plain a lie. It means somebody else is paying for your college. That doesn't mean, however, that there could not be a situation that is done to correct some of these injustices. Perfect example for me, the perfect example is the United Negro College Fund as opposed to affirmative action. Affirmative action basically says that black students will be able to get into schools or graduate or whatever the case may be at a lower standard. To me, that is, if you want to talk about institutionalized destruction, that's it. Telling somebody that because you're black, you can get into this college with 400-point lower score, whatever the case may be, than a white student, you are beginning the entire process by telling this person they're inferior, whether they believe it or not. I mean, whether you believe it or not, that is the message that they get. You're inferior. And for those people, for those black students that do excel, they have to carry this around with them for the rest of their lives. They have to say, now people are going to wonder, I graduated from Harvard Law School. Is that because they gave me such a break to get in because I'm black? So this kind of thing is horrendously destructive. But on the other hand, there's no question that there are economic difficulties, and there's no question that these economic difficulties are not distributed evenly among the races. So now you have something like the United Negro College Fund, which has been around for a long time. They're not asking for lower standards, at least in the world that I understand how they function. They're not saying we want to be given a break and come in on lower standards. What they're saying is we can clear any bar that white students can clear, anybody else can clear for that matter. We just don't have the money. And so what they're doing is they're giving people money to get to college based on merit, and it's a wonderful system. And this kind of thing can be applied all the way across society. But you are not going to have a racially equivalent output until you have equivalent social rewards for success. And this is why Asian kids do better than white kids do in virtually every category in terms of income and in terms of scholastic achievement. And it's a real simple thing, Scott. If you look at what social pressure is put on an Asian kid to succeed, by succeed I mean getting good grades in school. That's my strict definition of success in this case. Versus what social pressure or social approval is based on a black kid in the same situation. They are very, very different situations. And to pretend that they're not, and to expect that somehow those people whose entire parents and whose entire families and whose entire lives have been said, you will do well in school, it's essential that you do well in school, it's very important to us, as opposed to people who say, if you do well in school, you're just a sellout and you're an Uncle Tom and you're acting white. If you don't think that's going to produce two different levels of academic success and then economic success, you're out of your freaking mind. And it's just that simple. So when are we going to get serious about this? When are we going to have this conversation? I don't know. I'm ready to have it now. I'm always ready to have it. That's why I'm a racist and a Nazi and all the rest of it, because I'm willing to talk about the stuff that is making Black America suffer at the hands of Black American politicians who want them to suffer, who need them to suffer, who absolutely need them to be utterly dependent on themselves. And I think it's a disgrace and I think it's a crime, and I'm not willing to sit still and put up with it.
Testing the merits of conservative principles 5 times a week. Bill Whittle now comes to you thanks to the generosity of the members at BillWhittle.com who make everything we do possible here. We appreciate their efforts on your behalf, frankly, the people who are paying for this for people who are not currently paying for it. They're doing that because they want you to hear this. If you'd like to be part of the team of producers that is spreading this kind of message around the world, then join us at BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.